In class, we were talking about Greek vase painting, Greek black figure vase painting. We were talking about Heracles, the half-mortal, half-sun god of Zeus. Remember that Zeus's wife Hera became quite jealous of her stepson and had him driven insane. He killed his family and was forced to do a series of labors in order to atone for his sin. And in class we had seen the 12th of these labors go to the kingdom of the underworld, which is ruled by Hades, Pluto, to the Romans, and capture the guard dog of the underworld, Cerberus, who had multiple heads and a dragon for a tail. Hercules' fourth labor is depicted on this other plot from the Walters Art Museum. He's to capture a wild boar from Mount Erymanthus, the Erymanthean boar. And this wild boar devoured everything in its path, and what Hercules did was to chase it until it got tired, and then he captures it, and he carries it back to Mycenae with him to give to his enemy, King Eurystheus. King Eurystheus was the one who actually commanded him to do the 12 labors. And here we see Hercules bringing the wild boar, the Erymanthean boar, back to Eurystheus. And we see that he's depicted as a hero, whereas his enemy is depicted as a coward, trying to hide inside a jar that's been buried in the ground. And of course, he can't hide from the half-god Heracles, and he's menacing him now with this boar that devours everything in its path. Like we've seen with other plots, there are unexplained figures here. The two women on either side are not part of the legend, and again, they're probably muses, inspirations, or Greek chorus, but certainly they are not intended as physical figures in the same way that Heracles, Eurystheus, and the boar are considered. And here's a detail of one of those two women. We can see again the black figure style where the lines have been scratched through the burnished black slip. Also other colors added into this, these touches of red as well, but again this archaic style which is much more fluid and linear and moving. Not every pot depicts a series of Greek myths. Back up. On the reverse side of this pot, that's appropriate for an amphora, which is a jug for mixing wine, we see Dionysus handing a wine vase to one of his female followers. This is a Dionysiac wine party, if you will, and he's surrounded by two of his colleagues who are satyrs, half man, half goat, used by the Greeks to represent being given over to strong wine. Being part animal makes them subhuman rather than superhuman, and they are reveling here as part of this party. Notice the vine tendrils around them as symbols of grapes. And you'll also notice that one of these two satyrs has a very, very prominent erection, which is common for satyrs, and again relates to the sort of hedonistic festival that we see going on the backside of the Heracles and Eurystheus amphora. Whereas earlier Attic pottery, archaic Greek pottery, was black figure, later in the 6th century we moved to what is called red figure vase painting, where we're still using oxidized slip for the black, but now it takes up the background rather than the foreground, and our lines here are no longer scratched in, but are painted on, probably with a syringe putting little beads of color everywhere on the surface of the pot. Here again we see that continued interest in Heracles, the half-god, half-man, that figure who treads the space between the mortals and their gods. And this one, he's on his way to his 11th labor. This isn't one of the labors per se, but it's in between. He has other struggles he goes through. And here he meets Antaeus. Antaeus is the son of the earth and gains all of his power from the earth. And in order to complete the 11th labor, Hercules has to get past it by wrestling him. And so this forces out the other trials that he has, the other labors. And often Hercules has to stop, or Heracles has to stop and wrestle someone. And that's the case here with Antaeus, is that he has to defeat him at wrestling in order to pass. And since Antaeus is the son of the earth, this is him on the right. Since Antaeus is the son of the earth, he gains his power from the earth, which means that in Greco-Roman wrestling rules, pinning him to the ground only made him stronger. It made it almost impossible to defeat him. So as the story goes, Heracles has taken off his lion's skin, the Nemean lion's skin, as he engages in this wrestling match. And here we see him in the middle of the struggle. He hasn't yet won. And the way he's going to defeat Antaeus eventually is he'll pick him up. And once he lifts him off the ground, all of the strength drains from Antaeus' body. He's able to break his back. But here we see him deep in the struggle, and relying again entirely on his own strength. This lion skin and his club that you see here, his standard attributes, supernatural attributes, if you will, are put aside as he struggles as a mortal. You'll also notice again that we have this Greek chorus behind him, these female figures, there's three of them there, that again are not part of the story per se, but are the muses, the inspirations for this, the Greek chorus who retells the story for us in a way. In this detail, you can see that the style is significantly more sophisticated. The bodies twist and turn in space. Look in particular at the pose of Antaeus, and you can see, just as we saw with some architectural sculpture, these are becoming much more realistic and much more naturalistic, but also much more complicated and much more sophisticated in the rendering of the human body, the figure in action. And in fact, the Greeks said about Euphronius, our potter and painter, they said that he was actually the very best of all of the Greek painters in showing the human figure in action. And we see that well represented here. You can also see how that black slip is built up on the surface of the pot so that Heracles' hair stands up in globules, if you will, here on the surface that have also been polished. And there's Antaeus' head, scraggly hair, directly behind him. As we move toward the end of the 5th century, we move to a new style of vase painting called red figure, which is exactly the opposite of black figure. We're still using the same kinds of pigments, but we're using them in a reverse manner, where the black slip that's oxidized and polished now forms the background for the red figures, and also forms the thin lines that make up the musculature. And you'll notice that the bodies have become much more realistic and realistically proportioned. Those tiny little feet that we had before, well, there's still some remnant of that, but the proportions seem significantly stronger, rather than these sort of curly Q flourishes that we saw in black figure painting. Here, the lines all really very much detail musculature, and in strong anatomical detail with a keen understanding of how the human body works. And this is, in fact, something we've seen in all of the works we've looked at, whether it was architectural sculpture or Kouros figures, or here in vase painting, that the understanding of the human figure gets stronger, and the rendering of that figure in increasingly realistic and complicated ways also increases through the course of the 500s BC. The story here is another of Heracles' 12 labors. It's actually not one of the labors themselves. In each of the 12 labors, Heracles encountered other difficulties en route, and in this case, on his way to his 11th labor, he comes across the son of the earth, Antaeus, who gains all of his power from the earth, and he's asked to wrestle him before he can pass. Now, of course, this is difficult because in Greek wrestling, you're supposed to pin him to the ground, and since he draws all his power from the earth, that meant if you pinned him, he only got stronger. So Heracles comes up with a wonderful solution to this. He holds him in the air, all the strength during Vedavanteus, and he breaks his back. So in order to pit himself against this god of the earth, Heracles has taken off his lion's skin. Remember, the Nemean lion was his first labor. Laid it aside because this is hand-to-hand human combat. The women in the background, there are 3 of them this time, aren't explained. Again, they're probably that Greek chorus cheering them on, allegorical or supernatural figures behind them. In this detail, you can see how the lines now form muscle groups, his pecs, his abdominals, all very closely delineated. You can even see how the hair of Heracles is built up in these small knobs or globules that have been polished, like the rest of the black. But again, that interest in musculature. Here we can see the tendons of Heracles' arm, the muscles of his forearm, as well as the figures twist and turn in space in a realistic and complex manner. When writing about these potters, the ancient Greeks said that Euphronius, who's the potter and the painter here, that Euphronius was in fact the best vase painter when it came to depicting the body in motion, the body in action, and we see that really strongly here. Now, the Walters also has a good collection of red figure vases as well, and again we can see the increasing realism and accurate proportions, the complicated movement and twists and turns in space, the figure moving one direction but turning back the other way. This figure here standing, walking that direction, but we see him from the back, so he's actually from his hip, turning in space, and then looking this direction. So we're seeing across the back of his shoulder blades here, and the front of his hips here as the figure twists and turns in 3 dimensions. You can almost imagine his left arm here coming around to embrace the figure as he catches her. Now, the story here is a young Greek warrior in battle with one of the superhuman race of Amazons, this group of women from an island who had sort of superhuman power. Right? We think he's probably Achilles, another of these half-god figures that we talked about in the Black figure period as well. According to legend, he fought one of the Amazon tribe and fell in love with her. And what's interesting about this pod is it seems to focus on their eyes meeting as he grabs her in battle, as if he's going to stop immediately and maybe now embrace her. Again, even though it's a mythological scene, one of the things we've seen over and over again is that these myths provide the basis for Greeks to explore the humanity of us all as a basis for human interaction, and that's certainly the case here with this warrior and Amazon making direct eye contact, like I said, probably Achilles. Our last red figure pot is not a myth per se, but shows an event from a warrior's life. After training, any young warrior would go back to his family altar to prepare for war. And so here a young woman holds his shield for him with this snake on it. Again, apotropaic device, a way of warding off evil, and hands him his helmet. There's a nice detail of her. Again, it's a human drama, it's a momentous moment with this eye contact across the helmet. Almost like there's hints of coming tragedy again, because of course he's going off to a very uncertain fate. Also interesting here is the control of the human body. The body is now turned to where one of the legs is locked and the other one is at rest. In other words, he's resting most of his weight on one leg. One arm is bent, the other more relaxed, and you'll notice that the flexed arm and the flexed leg are opposite each other. The body really seems to stand in a pose that bears weight. The proportions seem a little awkward. His torso is a bit on the long side, but when we look at those legs, that is an accurate rendering of how a body stands in 3 dimensions, rendered on a 2-dimensional surface. Well, that's the end of this first screencast that's going to cover material that we lost to the sauna of a classroom that we had.